Hello, my name is Nicholas Morton, and in this talk we're going to be looking at the Mongol conquests in the Near East. And in this first talk we're going to be looking at the early phases of those conquests, and the history of these events really starts in about 1218. Now, when I say the Near East, that could encompass a very broad region from Persia, modern-day Iran in the east, all the way across to the Mediterranean seaboard in the west. But we're going to be focusing in particular on the western part. So perhaps if you draw a line south from the Caspian Sea to the west of that, that would encompass much of Iraq, Syria, modern-day Turkey, Mediterranean coastline, Egypt, that sort of area. All right, so in 1218, a convoy of merchants arrived in the Khwarezmian border town of Utra. Now, the Khwarezmian Empire at this stage was a vast territory encompassing Persia, as well as parts of Iraq, and then other peripheral regions, all the way up to the Central Asian steppe margins in the north. And Utra was on its northern borders. Now, when these merchants arrived in Utra, it seems likely that their main objective was to trade their various wares. And they were particularly significant because these merchants came from the Mongol Empire, which was rapidly expanding during this time, having conquered much of northern China, as well as the various different communities across Central Asia and encroaching on other territories as well. So this was important diplomatically, not just commercially. Still, something seems to have happened when these merchants arrived, because they were arrested. And we're not quite sure why they were arrested. Perhaps there was a disagreement in the market. Perhaps there was some suspicion that they were spying. We're not quite clear on that. But Inalchuk, the city governor, he placed them under arrest and then sought clarification from the ruler of the Khwarezmian Empire, Sultan Muhammad, what to do about the merchants he had arrested. And the instructions he received were very clear, that they should be executed. And so Inalchuk carried out those instructions, and the merchants were indeed executed, except for one, who managed to get away and return to Genghis Khan, the ruler of the Mongol Empire, and report what had happened. And this event is crucial because it saw the beginning of the Mongol conquests into the Near Eastern region. Because soon afterwards, in 1219, a Mongol army arrives and lays siege to Utra. And from that point, Utra will ultimately fall, followed by a series of other major cities such as Bukhara and Samarkand across the northern frontier of the Khwarezmian Empire. And over the next 2 years, Mongol armies spread out across the Khwarezmian Empire, conquering cities, towns, and so much of the eastern and central parts of the Khwarezmian Empire fall during this era. Now, the Khwarezmian Sultan's son, a commander called Jalal al-Din, puts up quite a fair amount of resistance, although he too is eventually forced to withdraw in 1221. He takes shelter in northern India. Now, one of the reasons the Mongol armies managed to conquer such large areas in the Khwarezmian Empire is due in part to the defensive strategy adopted by the empire at this time. Because the ruler, rather than trying to march out and meet the Mongols in battle, he divided his army into garrison forces between the Khwarezmian Empire's various border cities, which meant that those cities were very well protected, but it also meant the Mongols could deal with those cities one by one, while sending out raiding forces with very little fear of being intercepted. So, while the central and eastern districts of the Khwarezmian Empire were in the process of being conquered, a force of Mongol cavalry, about 20,000 troops under two very seasoned commanders called Jebi and Subutai, they were sent west, and their job was to try and hunt down the Khwarezmian Sultan. In fact, they never caught him. It seems likely that he died still free from Mongol control on an island in the Caspian Sea. But this Mongol flying column moved west, underneath the Caspian Sea, through regions such as Rey, which is near modern-day Tehran, before then moving up towards the Caucasus, what today would be modern-day Azerbaijan, Armenia and Georgia. In 1220-1221, these forces were active in Greater Armenia and Georgia, where they defeated every army sent against them. And then subsequently, we're sort of 1222 now, they crossed the Caucasus Mountains and then moved north up the western coasts of the Caspian Sea, where in 1223 they defeated a sort of conglomerate force involving forces from the Rus principalities as well as other allies at the Battle of the Kalka River, where again the Mongols were victorious, and then the Mongols returned back to their own territory by moving north of the Caspian Sea, almost completing a circuit around its circumference. Now, this expedition by Jebi and Subutai was really important, because this was really the first time that Mongol forces had reached the areas of the Near East, sort of to the west of the Caspian Sea. And so for many rulers in this area, this was a complete shock. Naturally, this was true for rulers whose lands lay directly on the Mongols' invasion path, who suffered very heavy casualties. But also other powers in the region also now found themselves confronting the prospect of a future Mongol invasion. And so it's interesting to see their reactions. And one particular reaction can be seen in Egypt, because while the Mongols were invading the region from the east, another major invasion was taking place in Egypt, and this was the arrival of the Fifth Crusade. And so the Fifth Crusade was trying to reconquer Jerusalem. The way it tried to do that was, well, the army began to assemble in 1217 in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and it conducted a few limited raiding expeditions around its periphery. But in 1218, it began its main expedition, which was the attempt to conquer Egypt. And the strategic thinking behind the crusade was to try and gain control of the agricultural resources of the Nile Delta, conquer the major trading cities on the Mediterranean coast, as well as Cairo, and with Egypt under control, that would then provide them with the resources they would need to permanently fund the reconquest of Jerusalem. Still, it's interesting to see how news of the arrival of the Mongol forces affected the crusade. Because initially the Crusaders took a long time to get into their first target, which was the city of Damietta on the Mediterranean coast. But in 1219, they did eventually succeed in conquering the city, despite very heavy resistance from the Ayyubid Empire. And when I say Ayyubid Empire, I'm talking about the empire set up by Saladin and now ruled by his heirs. Ayyubid coming from the name of Saladin's father, Ayyub. So, once the Crusaders had conquered Damietta, their next goal was to try and advance up the Nile and then conquer Cairo, which would then mark the culmination of their crusade. But they didn't. And there's several reasons why they didn't. One reason is that they were anticipating reinforcements from Emperor Frederick II of Germany, which never in fact arrived. But another reason is that they learnt that there was an army advancing from the east towards Syria and the Levantine region, and they believed that these reports of an army advancing westwards towards the Levantine region were actually reports of the advance of the armies of Prester John. Now, a little bit of background's needed here. There is a long-standing myth by this stage in Western Christendom that somewhere to the east, in the Indies as they described it, lay an enormous and very powerful kingdom ruled by a Christian king or emperor called Prester John. And the legend reported that one day Prester John would march to their aid. And so when the Crusaders learnt about this distant army advancing towards them out of the east, they thought they were hearing reports of Prester John's army. And so one of the possible reasons why they didn't staged their advance on Cairo at this particular point is that they thought that it wouldn't be long until Prester John's forces arrived, would reinforce them, and therefore help them in achieving their goals. Now, of course, needless to say, the Mongol armies were not the armies of Prester John for the simple reason that Prester John never existed, but it's interesting to see how the mere rumours of the Mongol advances begin to change the geopolitics and the decision-making of powers at war, in this case in Egypt, at the same time. Another impact concerns the Kingdom of Georgia, which during the Fifth Crusade was contemplating sending reinforcements to the crusading army, but ultimately when the Mongol forces began their invasions into Georgia, clearly that wasn't possible, and so no reinforcements were sent. Likewise, another important consideration is that when the Ayyubids ultimately defeated the crusading army, one of the reasons for this was that the Ayyubid Empire's northern commanders in northern Syria, so the borders of Anatolia, that's modern-day Turkey, they had to make a very difficult decision. Should they remain in the north, in case the Mongols move any further west and attack their own territory, or should they move south in order to reinforce the Ayyubids in Egypt and therefore to help them defeat the Crusaders? Well, in the event, they decided to move to Egypt and to reinforce the Ayyubid Empire in Egypt against the Crusaders, and that was a key moment in the defeat of the Crusade. But it can't have been an easy decision, given that the Mongols were so close on their eastern borders as they were conducting their wars of conquest and invasion in the Caucasus. So this talk brings us to the end of the first major phase of the Mongol invasions into the Near East. The next talk will pick up this narrative, and I hope you found it interesting, and please do look at the other talks in this collection.